They say you can judge a man's character by how he treats those he considers beneath him. Jean-Claude Van Damme was about to learn that lesson in the most humiliating way possible. The muscles from Brussels had conquered Hollywood, accumulated millions, and built an ego to match his bank account. He'd heard the whispers about Chucknorris, the quiet martial arts legend who'd stepped away from the spotlight, and Van Damme dismissed him with a laugh. Old news. Yesterday's hero, a relic from a bygone era, who couldn't possibly compare to his own magnificence. So when their paths crossed an exclusive Beverly Hills charity gala, Van Damme saw an opportunity to cement his superiority, to publicly diminish the aging legend and claim his throne as the undisputed king of martial arts cinema. What Van Damme didn't understand was that respect isn't earned through arrogance or flashy kicks. It's earned through humility, integrity, and the quiet confidence of someone who has absolutely nothing to prove. Chucknorris was about to remind him of that truth in a way he'd never forget. The crystal chandeliers of the Beverly Hilton cast prismatic light across a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Hollywood elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hospital fundraiser, a glittering affair where millionaires wrote checks they'd never miss and congratulated themselves on their philanthropy. The champagne flowed freely. Conversations hummed with the particular energy of people who lived to be seen, and somewhere in the background, a string quartet played Vivaldi with mechanical precision. Jean-Claude Van Damme stood near the center of it all, holding court like a king among subjects. At 52, he still maintained a physique that had made him famous, his body a testament to obsessive training and careful management. His custom Armani tuxedo fit, like a second skin, tailored to emphasize every sculpted muscle. A cluster of admirers surrounded him, younger actors and aspiring martial artists who hung on his every word, their laughter coming a beat too quick, their attention desperately seeking his approval. The problem with American action cinema today, Van Damme declared, his Belgian accent still thick despite decades in Hollywood, is that they have forgotten what real martial arts looks like. They use stunt doubles, they use wires, they use computers. In my day, we did everything ourselves. Real kicks, real splits, real danger. He punctuated this with a dismissive wave of his champagne flute, the golden liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. A young actress with impossibly white teeth nodded enthusiastically. You're absolutely right, Jean-Claude. Nobody does it like you. The validation washed over Van Damme like a warm bath. This was what he lived for, this recognition, this acknowledgement of his superiority. He clawed his way up from nothing, from sleeping in his car and begging for auditions to becoming an international action star. He'd earned his arrogance, paid for it with blood and sweat and countless hours in the gym. Why shouldn't he enjoy it? I tell you something else, Van Damme continued, warming to his theme. These so-called legends from the 70s and 80s, they would not survive in today's cinema. The stunts are harder. The choreography is more complex. The audience expectations are higher. What impressed people 30 years ago will be laughable now. His entourage murmured agreement, though some of them shifted uncomfortably. They could sense where this was heading, and it made them nervous. Van Damme either didn't notice or didn't care. That's when he spotted Chucknorris across the room. The martial arts legend stood quietly near one of the tall windows, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. He wore a simple black tuxedo with none of the flashy accessories that decorated the other guests. No designer watch, no ostentatious cufflinks, no carefully coiffed hairstyle. At 75, his beard had gone completely white, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his shoulders broad despite his age. He held a glass of water, not champagne, and seemed content to observe rather than participate in the social theater around him. Van Damme felt something twist in his chest, an uncomfortable mixture of jealousy and resentment. Chucknorris had been the gold standard once, the action hero that everyone else measured themselves against. But that was decades ago. The man was ancient now, living off his reputation, probably couldn't even throw a proper kick anymore. Yet people still spoke his name with reverence, still treated him like royalty. It irritated Van Damme in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "You see that man over there?" Van Damme said to the circle, nodding toward Chuck. "That is Chuck Norris. You know, the old Texas Ranger from television." He said it with just enough condescension to make his opinion clear. One of the younger actors, a rising star named Marcus, who'd recently booked his first action role, looked genuinely excited. "Really? Chuck Norris is here? Man, I grew up watching his movies. He's a legend." "Legend," Van Damme repeated, tasting the word like it was sour. Yes, he was very popular in his time. But you understand, the martial arts have evolved significantly since then. What he did was very basic, very simple. Karate tournament fighting, simple kicks and punches. Nothing like the complex choreography we do today. Another voice, a stunt coordinator named Rachel who'd worked with Van Damme on his last film, spoke up cautiously. "With respect, Jean-Claude, Chuck Norris is a legitimate martial artist. He's got black belts in multiple disciplines. He competed at the highest levels before movies were even on his radar." Van Damme waved this away. "Competition, yes, many years ago, against people who were also doing basic techniques. I am not saying he was not good for his time. I am saying his time has passed. The sport has evolved. The cinema has evolved. He is not." The group had gone quiet now, their discomfort palpable. They could see what was coming, could sense Van Damme working himself up to something reckless. But none of them had the courage or the standing to stop him. Van Damme took a long drink of his champagne, liquid courage mixing with his already inflated ego. In his mind, he was doing everyone a favor. Someone needed to speak the truth, to acknowledge that the old guard needed to step aside and let the new generation take center stage. And if he happened to elevate his own status in the process, well, that was just a natural consequence of speaking honestly. He started walking toward Chuck Norris, his entourage trailing behind him like nervous courtiers following a king into battle. Van Damme's mind was already crafting the conversation, imagining how it would play out. He'd be gracious, of course, acknowledge the older man's past contributions, but he'd also make it clear who the real martial artist in the room was, who the real star was. Chuck Norris must have sensed the approach because he turned from the window, his blue eyes calm and assessing. There was no hostility in his gaze, no defensiveness, just a quiet attentiveness that spoke of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Mr. Norris," Van Damme said, extending his hand with theatrical flourish. "Jean-Claude Van Damme. I want to come over and introduce myself." Chuck took the offered hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "I know who you are, Jean-Claude. Nice to meet you properly." "The pleasure is mine," Van Damme said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I must tell you, I grew up watching your films. You were quite the action star in your day." There it was, that phrase again. In your day. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of understanding. He'd heard this tone before, from countless young fighters who thought age diminished skill, who confused physical youth with genuine mastery. "That's kind of you to say," Chuck replied evenly. "I enjoyed making those films. They gave me a chance to share martial arts with a wide audience." Van Damme smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, spreading martial arts to the masses. Very noble. Though, of course, cinema martial arts is quite different from real martial arts. All that Hollywood choreography, the camera tricks, the stunt doubles, not like actual fighting. Several people in Van Damme's entourage winced. Rachel, the stunt coordinator, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Marcus, the young actor, glanced between the two men with growing anxiety. Chuck simply nodded. "You're right about that. Movie fighting and real fighting are very different things, though I try to keep things as authentic as possible." "Authentic," Van Damme repeated, seizing on the word. "That is interesting. Tell me, Mr. Norris, When was the last time you actually trained, actually practiced real martial arts? Because, and please do not take offense, but at your age, maintaining real skills becomes difficult. The body slows down. The reflexes diminish. It is simply nature. The air had changed now. The nearby conversations had quieted as people sensed confrontation. Several prominent guests had turned to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. This was a kind of moment that could become tabloid fodder, social media content, industry gossip that would spread through Hollywood like wildfire. Chuck's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. "I train every morning," he said quietly, "same as I've done for 60 years. The intensity might have changed, but the discipline hasn't." Van Damme laughed, a sound that carried more derision than humor. "Morning training at 75. I am sure it is very gentle, very careful, not like real training, not like what competitive fighters do." "Jean-Claude," Rachel said urgently, tugging at his sleeve, "maybe we should." "I am simply having a conversation," Van Damme said, shaking her off. He was too far into it now, too committed to back down. The champagne and his ego had formed a toxic combination, and some reckless part of him wanted to push this, wanted to publicly diminish this legend who'd held his position for far too long. Chuck took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm but carried an edge of steel. "You're right, that I'm not a competitive fighter anymore. Haven't been for many years. But martial arts isn't just about competition or cinema. It's about discipline, respect, continuous learning. Those things don't diminish with age." Discipline and respect. Van Damme echoed mockingly. Yes, very philosophical, very wise. But philosophy does not win fights. Speed wins fights. Power wins fights. Youth wins fights. And with all respect, Mr. Norris, those are things you no longer possess. A woman gasped somewhere in the crowd. Marcus looked horrified. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. The musicians distracted by the drama unfolding across the ballroom. Chuck studied Van Damme for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "You think martial arts is about winning fights? Is that not the entire point?" Van Damme spread his hands. "To prove who is superior? Who is strongest? Who is the best?" "No," Chuck said simply. "That's what insecure people think martial arts is about. True martial arts is about mastering yourself, not others. It's about becoming a better version of yourself yesterday, not compare yourself to everyone else today." Van Damme's face flushed. The response had been delivered so calmly, so quietly, but it cut deeper than any insult. Because somewhere beneath his bravado, beneath his carefully constructed confidence, Jean-Claude Van Damme knew the older man was right, and that knowledge made him angrier. "That is very poetic," Van Damme said, his voice rising. "Very inspiring. But I wonder, Mr. Norris, if perhaps these philosophical thoughts are simply how old fighters justify their inability to compete anymore. It is easy to say martial arts is not about fighting when you can no longer fight." The crowd had grown now. At least 50 people surrounded them, including several major Hollywood players, a famous director, 2 studio executives, and at least 3 people with their phones out, definitely recording. Whatever happened next would be documented, shared, analyzed, and dissected across the internet. Chuck's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't need to justify anything to you or anyone else. I know who I am and what I'm capable of. The opinions of others don't change that." "Then perhaps," Van Damme said, "you would not mind demonstrating these capabilities? A simple demonstration. Nothing dangerous. Just to show that these old techniques you are so proud of still have relevance." He turned to address the growing crowd, playing to them now. "I am sure everyone will be fascinated to see if the legendary Chucknorris can still perform the moves that made him famous." Rachel grabbed his arm harder this time. Jean-Claude, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. I am simply asking for a demonstration, Van Damme insisted, shaking her off again. What is wrong with that? If Mr. Norris is still so capable, surely he would not mind showing us. Unless, of course, he cannot. Chuck remained perfectly still, his expression carved from stone. The insult was clear, the challenge unmistakable. Every eye in the room was on him now, waiting to see how he would respond. The young people expected him to back down, to make excuses about his age, to gracefully retreat. The older guests, those who knew his reputation, held their breath and waited. You want a demonstration? Chuck asked quietly. Van Damme smiled triumphantly. If you are willing. Nothing serious. Just a simple exchange. Show me these timeless techniques you speak of. Here? Now? Why not? There is plenty of space. The floor is clear. Unless you prefer to decline. Chuck looked around the ballroom at the expectant faces, the recording phones, the mixture of excitement and anxiety in the crowd. He could walk away. Should walk away. This was beneath him, a childish display of ego that served no purpose. He'd spent decades teaching that martial arts wasn't about proving yourself to others, that the true battle was internal. But he also recognized something in Van Damme's eyes, something he'd seen in countless young fighters over the years. Not just arrogance, but insecurity masked as confidence. A desperate need for validation hidden beneath layers of bravado. This wasn't really about Chucknorris at all. It was about Van Damme trying to prove something to himself. And sometimes Chuck knew the kindest thing you could do for someone drowning in their own ego was to let them hit bottom. All right, Chuck said quietly. A simple demonstration. The crowd immediately began backing up, creating a rough circle in the center of the ballroom. The energy had shifted from uncomfortable tension to electric anticipation. Phones were everywhere now. Everyone wanted to capture this moment. This impossible scenario where a 75-year-old legend was about to face off against a martial arts movie star 30 years younger. Van Damme removed his tuxedo jacket with a flourish, handing it to Marcus, who took it reluctantly. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck, getting loose. This was his element, this performance, this opportunity to shine. He'd sparred with professional fighters, trained with the best choreographers in the business. This would be easy, almost too easy. He'd make it look respectful, pull his techniques, not embarrass the old man too badly. But everyone would see clearly who the superior martial artist was. Chuck simply unbuttoned his jacket cuffs and rolled up his sleeves. No theatrics, no warm-up routine, no display. Just a quiet preparation that spoke of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. Light contact only, Chuck said. We're not trying to hurt each other. Of course, Van Damme agreed magnanimously. This is just a friendly demonstration, a conversation between martial artists. They faced each other in the center of the circle. Van Damme adopted a textbook fighting stance, his guard high, his body coiled and ready. Chuck stood in a simple ready position, his hands relaxed at his sides, his weight evenly distributed. To the uninformed observer, he looked almost casual, unprepared. Van Damme smiled. This was going to be even easier than he'd thought. He moved first, testing the waters with a quick jab. Nothing serious, just gauging distance and reaction time. The punch was crisp, fast, technically perfect. It should have at least forced a reaction, a block or a dodge. Chuck moved his head exactly 2 inches to the left. The punch whispered past his ear, missing by a hair's breadth. Van Damme's smile faltered. He'd expected slower reflexes, diminished reaction time. That dodge had been almost casual, effortless. He tried again, this time a combination. Jab cross hook, a classic boxing sequence he drilled thousands of times. Fast, powerful, precise. Chuck slipped each punch with minimal movement, his head moving in small, efficient circles, never where the fists arrived. His feet barely moved. His hands stayed at his sides. The crowd murmured. Even those with no martial arts training could sense something was wrong with Van Damme's narrative. This didn't look like an old man struggling with diminished reflexes. Van Damme felt the first flutter of doubt in his chest. He increased the pace, throwing faster combinations, mixing in low kicks, trying over well with volume and speed. Every technique he'd learned, every trick he'd picked up from 20 years in action cinema, he unleashed in a fluid sequence. Chuck moved through it all like water flowing around stones. He didn't block, didn't counter, just evaded with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. Van Damme was throwing 10 techniques for every foot of ground he covered, burning energy rapidly. Chuck was moving 6 inches at a time and making every attack miss. "You see," Van Damme called out breathlessly, playing to the crowd even as sweat began to bead on his forehead. "Good reflexes still, but defense is only half of martial arts. No? What about offense?" He was trying to save face, to reframe what everyone was watching. Yes, the old man could still dodge, impressive for his age, but could he actually fight back? Chuck stopped moving. "You sure you wanted to show you offense?" Something in his tone made Van Damme hesitate, but he'd come too far to back down now, trapped by his own ego and the dozens of recording phones documenting every moment. "Of course. Show me what you got, old man." The instant the words left his mouth, Van Damme knew he'd made a mistake. Chuck moved. It wasn't the flashy, spinning movie-style technique Van Damme had expected. There were no acrobatics, no unnecessary flourishes. Just pure, devastating efficiency born from 60 years of actual martial arts training. A simple sidekick, so fast it was almost invisible, stopped 1 inch from Van Damme's solar plexus. Perfect balance, perfect control, perfect technique. Van Damme hadn't even seen it coming, certainly couldn't have defended it. Before Van Damme could process what had happened, Chuck had withdrawn and moved again. A ridged hand stopped a hair's breadth from his throat, a sweep positioned perfectly to take out both legs. A palm strike frozen millimeters from his chin. 4 potential finishing techniques in less than 3 seconds, each one placed with absolute precision, each one demonstrating complete control. Chuck wasn't fighting. He was teaching a lesson. Then he stopped, returning to his relaxed, ready position as if nothing had happened. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Van Damme stood frozen, his mind trying to catch up with what his body had just experienced. He'd felt the air displacement from those techniques, felt the control power behind them. If Chuck had wanted to hurt him, Van Damme would be unconscious on the floor right now. Maybe worse. His face burned with humiliation. Every technique he'd thrown had missed. Every opening he thought he'd found had been a trap. He'd been completely outclassed by a man old enough to be his grandfather, and everyone had watched it happen. The phones had captured it all. Van Damme's carefully constructed self-image shattered like glass. All the years of convincing himself he was the best, the greatest martial artist in cinema, the living legend, it all crumbled in the face of genuine skill. He confused movie choreography with real martial arts, confused performing techniques with mastering them. He'd been living in an echo chamber of sycophants who'd told him what he wanted to hear, and he believed it completely. For a long moment, Van Damme just stood there, breathing hard, his mind reeling. The crowd waited, unsure what would happen next. Would he explode in anger? Make excuses? Storm out? Instead, something unexpected happened. Jean-Claude Van Damme dropped his guard and stepped back. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time that evening, his expression showed something real. Not arrogance, not performance, but genuine emotion. Shame, yes, but also something deeper. Understanding. Awareness. He started, his voice rough. He looked around at the crowd, at their expectant faces, at the phone still recording, then back to Chucknorris, who stood calmly, waiting, his expression neither triumphant nor angry, just patient. Van Damme closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted. The mask had cracked, and the real person underneath was showing through. "I apologize," he said quietly, "to you, Mr. Norris, and to everyone here. I have behaved terribly, with arrogance and disrespect." He looked directly at Chuck. "You tried to tell me what martial arts was really about, and I mocked you. You showed grace and wisdom, and I responded with insults. I am deeply ashamed." The crowd remained silent, everyone riveted by this unexpected turn. Apologies were rare in Hollywood, genuine ones almost unheard of. No one knew quite how to react. Chuck stepped forward and placed a hand on Van Damme's shoulder. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially publicly. That shows character." "But I was so—" Van Damme struggled for words. "I convinced myself that I was the best, that my way was the only way. I forgot that martial arts is about continuous learning, about respecting those who came before, about humility, all the things you tried to tell me. We all get lost sometimes," Chuck said gently. "The ego is a powerful thing, especially when the world keeps feeding it. But recognizing that is the first step toward real growth." Van Damme looked at the older man with new eyes. This wasn't just a faded celebrity from the 80s. This was a genuine master, someone who'd achieved what Van Damme had always claimed to want. True skill, earned respect, authentic mastery. Not the hollow praise of yes men or the fleeting validation of box office numbers, but the real thing. "Would you—" Van Damme hesitated, then continued. "Would you be willing to train with me sometime? To teach me? I realize now that despite all my success, despite all my films and all my training, I still have so much to learn." Chuck smiled, and the warmth in it transformed his entire face. "I'd be honored to train with you, Jean-Claude. That's what martial arts is really about, brothers helping each other get better." Van Damme felt something shift in his chest, a weight he didn't even know he'd been carrying suddenly lifting. All those years of proving himself, of comparing himself to others, of maintaining this exhausting image of superiority, it had been so draining. And for what? To impress people he didn't even like? To feed an ego that was never satisfied? He bowed deeply to Chucknorris, a proper martial arts bow showing genuine respect. "Thank you for the lesson and for your mercy. You could have hurt me badly. Instead, you taught me something I desperately needed to learn." "That's what teaching is," Chuck replied. "Sometimes the lesson is gentle. Sometimes it needs to be more direct. But it's always about helping someone grow, not tearing them down." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to genuine appreciation. This wasn't the blood sport they'd anticipated. It was something better, more meaningful. They'd witnessed a real transformation, a moment of genuine humility and growth. Over the next several months, Jean-Claude Van Damme became a regular visitor to Chuck Norris's training facility. The paparazzi caught them together frequently, but the photos told a different story than the tabloids expected. There was no rivalry, no competition. Just two martial artists training together, one teaching and one learning with genuine humility. Van Damme discovered that real martial arts training was far more demanding than movie choreography. Chuck pushed him hard, not with flashy techniques, but with fundamentals, with precision, with the kind of detailed work that built genuine skill rather than impressive-looking moves. It was humbling, exhausting, and exactly what Van Damme needed. He also started changing how he conducted himself in public. The bombastic interviews decreased. The claims of superiority disappeared. When asked about that night at the Beverly Hilton, Van Damme was consistently honest and self-deprecating. "I learned that night that being a martial artist in movies is not the same as being a true martial artist. Chucknorris reminded me what real skill looks like, what real mastery requires. I am grateful to him for that lesson, even though it was painful to learn." The transformation didn't go unnoticed in Hollywood. Directors and producers saw the change, saw the newfound humility and depth. Ironically, Van Damme's career experienced a resurgence. The roles that came his way had more substance, more complexity. He was no longer just playing the invincible action hero. He was playing real characters with real depth, and the performances showed a maturity that had been missing before. In interviews, Van Damme often spoke about that night, using it as a teaching moment. The greatest enemy of growth is the belief that you have nothing left to learn. I was trapped in that belief, convinced of my own superiority. Chucknorris freed me from that trap, and I am a better martial artist and a better person because of it. Years later, at another charity event, Van Damme would find himself in a similar situation. A young action star, barely 30, was holding court and talking dismissively about the older generation of martial arts actors. Van Damme recognized the tone immediately, the arrogance masking insecurity, the desperate need for validation. Instead of challenging the young man, Van Damme simply smiled and said, "I used to think exactly like you. Then I met someone who taught me the difference between performing martial arts and truly understanding them. Best lesson I ever learned, even though my ego fought it every step of the way." The young actor looked confused, expecting either agreement or confrontation. Van Damme's gentle wisdom disarmed him completely. Real martial arts, Van Damme continued, is not about proving you are better than others. It is about becoming better than you were yesterday. The moment you understand that, everything changes. It was a lesson taught to him by Chucknorris, not through words, but through a demonstration of skill so complete that it shattered Van Damme's illusions. A lesson about humility, respect, and the quiet confidence of those who have nothing to prove. The ballroom that night had witnessed more than just a martial arts demonstration. It had witnessed a transformation, a moment where ego collided with reality and reality won, where arrogance met genuine skill and learned humility, where a man who thought he'd reached a peak discovered he'd merely been standing on a foothill and the real mountain still loomed above him. But most importantly, it showed that true martial arts mastery isn't about age or strength or speed. It's about character, discipline, and the wisdom to know that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. Chucknorris could have humiliated Van Damme completely. Instead, he taught him, showed mercy, and opened a door to genuine growth. That's the mark of a true master. Not someone who defeats others, but someone who helps others defeat their own limitations. Jean-Claude Van Damme left the Beverly Hilton that night a different person than the one who'd entered. The change wasn't instantaneous or complete. Growth never is, but it had begun. And it all started with a simple question that shattered his world. You think martial arts is about winning fights? No, he understood now. Martial arts is about winning the fight against your own ego, your own limitations, your own worst impulses. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to prove anything, because their skill speaks for itself. The kind of person who can show mercy when challenged, who can teach when others would simply dominate, who can help others grow rather than cutting them down. Chucknorris embodied all of that, and in one brief exchange on a ballroom floor, he passed that wisdom on to someone who desperately needed it, but didn't know he needed it. That's the power of those who have nothing to prove. They don't need to dominate or humiliate. They can afford to be gentle because their skill is unquestionable. They can afford to teach because they're not threatened by others' growth. They can afford to show mercy because their strength is secure. The lesson was simple but profound. Respect isn't demanded or taken. It's earned through humility, skill, and the wisdom to know that the strongest people are often the quietest ones. The ones who don't need to tell you how good they are. The ones who simply show you through their actions, their character, and their willingness to help others grow rather than tearing them down. Jean-Claude Van Damme learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it well, and in learning it, he became something he'd always claimed to be but never truly was, a genuine martial artist. Not just someone who performed techniques for cameras, but someone who understood what martial arts really means. The discipline, the respect, the continuous journey toward becoming better. And all it took was one demonstration from a 75-year-old man who moved like water, struck like lightning, and taught like a master. Chucknorris didn't just defeat Van Damme's techniques that night. He defeated Van Damme's ego, his illusions, his carefully constructed false image. And in doing so, he gave Van Damme the greatest gift one martial artist can give another, the truth. The truth that real strength doesn't need to advertise itself. Real skill doesn't need constant validation. Real mastery is quiet, confident, and always willing to help others grow. The truth that the greatest fight isn't against others. It's against yourself, against your ego, your insecurity, your need to constantly prove your worth. Win that fight, and all the others become irrelevant. That's what Chuck Norris understood. That's what he lived. And that's what he taught Jean-Claude Van Damme in one unforgettable lesson that the younger man would carry with him for the rest of his life. Respect the quiet ones. They're quiet because they have nothing to prove. And people with nothing to prove are the most dangerous opponents you'll ever face, because their confidence comes from genuine skill, earned through decades of discipline, not from the hollow validation of others. Jean-Claude Van Damme disrespected Chuck Norris and learned respect the hard way, but he learned it, and that made all the difference.